What's up guys, I'm James Withy, and today we're going to talk about watercolor tattoos. Okay, so like I said, in this video we're going to be discussing tattoos that are of the watercolor variety. So essentially the structure of this video is going to go like this. First I'm going to discuss exactly what a watercolor tattoo is. Then I'm going to talk about some of the different methods that tattoo artists use to apply watercolor tattoos, because there's more than one way to skin that cat. And then I'm going to discuss some of the potential problems that occur with watercolor tattoos and different ways that tattoo artists can alleviate those problems using the methods that I'll be describing earlier in the video. Okay, so first things first, what is a watercolor tattoo? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a tattoo that is made to look like it is done with watercolor paints. And what most people are visualizing when they think of a watercolor tattoo is going to be the typical watercolor tattoo that has a lot of expressive splash marks or strokes that look like they are similar to what puddling techniques look like when somebody paints with watercolor. This sort of tattoo has been a huge trend over the past decade or so, and I feel like I've seen quite a few of these tattoos pop up in public when I'm viewing tattoos and just looking at stuff that people have on their body. I know that I've done quite a few of them, in a variety of different styles. I really don't do watercolor tattoos anymore, but I do like the way they look in certain circumstances, and I'll do my best to explain everything about watercolor tattoos that I know for you guys. Now, the reason that watercolor tattoos are even a thing in the first place is, it probably has a lot to do with the versatility of tattooing. So tattooing is an extremely versatile medium, and I feel like it can be made to look like a lot of other artistic media super easily. And what I mean by that is you can make it look like charcoal if you want, you can make it look like an oil painting if you want, and you can definitely make it look like watercolor if you want. Now, with watercolor in particular, I feel like it was inevitable for somebody to experiment around with tattooing as a medium and try to make a tattoo look like watercolor, because tattooing is a water-based media. And what I mean by that is that, as the tattoo artist, when you're playing around and with your colors and everything, you're using water the entire time in your rinse cup to control the pigment concentration, the flow, all sorts of other factors. So the application of tattooing in some senses is a lot like watercolor. Okay, so now that we've discussed exactly what watercolor tattoos are and why they exist, let's go ahead and talk about some of the different ways that tattoo artists can apply watercolor tattoos and some of the different looks that they can possess. Okay, so this first image we're going to look at is a tattoo that I did about 3.5 or 4 years ago, and it's a Watercolor Rose. Now, I've done a bunch of watercolor tattoos and I've used a whole bunch of different methods for designing them. I've drawn them from scratch on paper, illustrating wise. I have taken realistic references and converted them to watercolor just using my own intuition. But this one I actually used a pretty unique method where I went onto a stock photo website called shutterstock.com, and I actually browsed through a whole bunch of images of watercolor roses that were actual paintings, and I purchased the rights to this painting right here so that I could reproduce it exactly as a watercolor tattoo. Now, this method isn't used very often by tattoo artists, but in my personal case, I feel like it was probably the most convincingly watercolor tattoo that I've ever done in terms of getting it to really, really look like a painting, and I think the method worked out pretty well. Now, as far as selecting my colors for a piece like this, it's important to mention that I did it in a really specific way. And the reason why is because I've painted quite a bit with watercolor myself. Anybody that has knows that watercolor is a transparent medium. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to different colors or pigments or whatever, there's opaque pigments that light can't pass through, there's transparent pigments that light can pass through very easily, and there's everything in between. And in watercolor, pretty much every pigment is transparent. If you have an opaque watercolor pigment, it's actually called gouache. It's not watercolor at all. So with that in mind, when I chose my palette for this watercolor tattoo, I tried to choose tattoo inks that were also transparent so that I could wash them down in the same way that I would with watercolor and create the most convincing effect in terms of it looking like it's that medium. So this next tattoo I'm going to show you guys is one that's done by my buddy Matt Garcia. Now this tattoo is a Banksy inspired tattoo where it's like a little girl holding a bunch of balloons, and throughout the piece you can see all the quintessential like watercolory splashy marks that make it look like it's a watercolor tattoo. This tattoo is quite a bit more illustrative than the one that I just showed you, meaning that it does have more hard lines, which probably increases its legibility quite a bit. But the real reason I think this tattoo is special is because the way that he applied the tattoo in terms of his choice of inks and the way he saturated it. Now, just a second ago, I told you guys that when most tattoo artists, including myself, do watercolor tattoos, we tend to choose more transparent pigments because we can wash them down more easily and make them look more like how watercolor actually looks, but in the skin. Now, when people tend to use like a lot of opaque pigments, usually they're not able to pull off the whole watercolor effect because the tattoo looks a little bit more choppy and chunky and the transitions aren't quite as smooth, and it just doesn't have that look to it. But my buddy Matt here somehow is able to do it. You know, I've never used this method before with any success, but he does use a lot of opaque pigments in the tattoo and still manages to make it look more like watercolor. And I think the areas that he uses more like transparent pigments and washes them down more are on like the outskirts of the tattoo whenever he's transitioning to empty skin. But the interior of the tattoo has a lot of opaque stuff in there. And the reason that's important is because it increases the amount of saturation drastically on the tattoo, and it kind of helps the tattoo observe more of the rules that we have within tattooing regarding longevity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So this next tattoo I'm going to show you guys is one that's done by my buddy named Nestor Murray. So Nestor is an absolute beast when it comes to doing watercolor tattoos, and the reason why is because he paints with watercolor quite a bit outside of tattooing. It's his favorite artistic media on the fine art side of things. So, you know, a lot of times he'll go ahead and he'll actually do a full-on watercolor painting on paper, and then he'll tattoo his painting verbatim in the skin and really like retain that high amount of watercolor, you know, quality to it in terms of the way that it looks as a result. Now, as far as the way he chooses his pigments, I talked to him briefly about it before I made this video, and it seems that he does, you know, largely what I would do with a watercolor tattoo, where he chooses pigments that are mostly transparent so that they're going to match up with the palette that he uses while he does watercolor. However, he does use some opaque pigments selectively throughout the piece, especially in areas where he's highlighting, where he wants the piece to have more physicality to it, similar to how Matt Garcia does, but probably just to a lesser extent. And as a result, Nestor's tattoos look very much like a watercolor painting still, but, you know, probably observe the rules of tattooing more than the watercolor tattoos that I did in the past. Okay, so speaking of the rules of tattooing, let's go ahead and talk about some of the potential problems with watercolor tattoos and some of the techniques that tattoo artists use to circumvent those problems. So the first problem I want to talk about is longevity. Watercolor tattoos are often criticized in the tattoo community for having poor longevity because they have a very low amount of saturation. And if you guys don't know what saturation is, you know, I have a whole nother video where I explain that concept in detail, but basically it's how solidly packed the tattoo is with pigment particles. So watercolor tattoos, because oftentimes tattoo artists will apply them in the same way that I have in the past, where they're choosing a lot of like transparent pigments and washing the tattoo down with water, that washing down with water to a very large extent, the way that it's done in watercolor tattooing, it results in a tattoo that has a lower amount of saturation than what would be considered normal. Because of this, it's very possible that if you get a watercolor tattoo that is washed down quite a bit in terms of its pigment concentration, it might end up fading faster than what a normal tattoo would, like say if it was done like with a traditional style or something like that, or black and gray. Your tattoo, if it's done with a really watercolory style and it's washed down very heavily, it might not last as long as those sort of tattoos. So some of the things that your tattoo artist can do to fix this problem are like, you know, if your tattoo artist puts more black in the tattoo, which black is like the longest lasting pigment out of all of them, and it won't fade quite as much as other colors will. If he puts a lot of black in the tattoo or outlines the tattoo, especially if it's outlined with black, that's going to help the tattoo last quite a bit longer. Or if the tattoo artist uses a more fully saturated and or opaque method, the way that my buddy Matt Garcia does, that's going to alleviate that aging issue quite a bit. And, you know, in the case of the tattoo that I showed you earlier with his is probably going to age very well because it has both black outlines and it has fully saturated color in it. So that tattoo is going to age exactly the same way that a traditional tattoo would. Now, another problem commonly associated with watercolor tattooing is the problem of legibility. Now, the problem with legibility can actually be caused by the previous problem that I just explained, where your tattoo is fading and it's becoming much less legible because of that premature fading, but it can also just be caused by all the different expressive, like splashy marks and puddling techniques that are commonly employed in watercolor tattooing. Those techniques can often busy a tattoo up quite a bit and make it harder for the viewer to tell what they're looking at, especially if the tattoo artist chooses a really wide color palette that has a big rainbow of colors and the viewer really doesn't know what to look at because it's so busy color-wise. Now, ways to fix that, and in terms of increasing the amount of legibility, obviously one is going to be to choose a more limited palette. That way it doesn't have every single color in the rainbow and people don't really know what to look at in the piece. Another way is to put outlines in the tattoo, because outlines tend to help tattoos read quite a bit better. And another thing that's probably a big factor in how legible your watercolor tattoo is going to be is the subject matter that you choose in the first place for your watercolor design. Obviously, if you choose something that people can tell what it is right away because it's a more distinctive type of piece of subject matter, you're going to be in better shape than if you were to choose something that's way more obscure and people really wouldn't even know what that was right away in the first place, even if it wasn't a watercolor tattoo. Making something like that, something more obscure, into a watercolor tattoo is going to make it way less legible overall. Okay, so the last problem I can think of concerning watercolor tattoos is that of scalability. Now, what I mean by that is that with watercolor tattoos, to me, it seems like it's pretty hard to make a large-scale project out of these sort of tattoos, such as a sleeve or a back piece or something like that. The reason why is because most watercolor tattoos are done with quite a few of those expressive, splashy marks on the outskirts of them that we all imagine when we're picturing watercolor tattoos in our head. Those splashy marks can look pretty good as a standalone piece, but because they make the edges of a tattoo so sharp and busy, I feel like they kind of hinder a tattoo artist's ability to transition one piece into another smoothly if it has too much of that shit in the original tattoo or in the new tattoo. So, it can look kind of busy in the areas in between the tattoos and kind of make it so that the viewer pays more attention to those areas than they should in terms of the priority of what they should be looking at in the piece, which is typically going to be the actual subject matter rather than the splashy marks around the subject matter, if that makes sense. Now, there are ways to solve this problem. The main one that sticks out to me is if a tattoo artist, instead of putting a bunch of really sharp, busy looking splash marks around the tattoo, the best way to me is if you're planning to do a large scale watercolor project like a sleeve, as the tattoo artist, you should probably be using a lot more soft transitions and more subtle puddling techniques in watercolor rather than a whole bunch of little jagged splashy marks and those sort of things. And that's going to make it so that you can just flow one piece into another and have everything be cohesive. And then maybe if you're capping off the top of a sleeve or the bottom of a sleeve or something, you can put more of those little speckles or something like that in there if you're sure that you're not transitioning to anything else. Now, a really great example of this sort of thing that I'm talking about is a tattoo artist named Leanne Mole or something like that. I'm going to put her name right here. I'm going to type it out just in case I'm butchering it and mispronouncing it, so you guys can look her up on Instagram. But she is my favorite watercolor artist overall. I feel like she does a great job of making tattoos that look like they are very realistic, but they also have that watercolor quality to them because of her color choices, and also because she does put some subtle puddling techniques in there that are reminiscent of watercolor. So in terms of a large-scale watercolor project, that's probably the best method to employ in my opinion. And if I were to do watercolor tattoos again, especially if it was something large scale, I would probably attempt to make my tattoos look a little bit more like how hers look, because I think that it's probably one of the better methods for executing that type of tattoo. But with that said, if it's a smaller tattoo, those little splash marks around the outskirts, they don't look bad at all, especially if the tattoo is standalone. And most tattoo clients, when they're coming in and asking for a watercolor tattoo from us, that's what they're expecting it to look like. So by no means am I saying that those little splashy marks are a bad thing. They just make it a little bit harder to transition from one piece to the next if you're adding on to one of those type of tattoos. So with that said, that's pretty much it for today's video. What we have talked about is what exactly a watercolor tattoo is. We've also discussed some of the techniques that tattoo artists use to create different looks within watercolor tattooing. And we've also talked about some of the potential problems that exist within watercolor tattooing and ways that tattoo artists can solve or alleviate those problems and prevent them from becoming an issue in the future. Now, if you guys have any questions whatsoever regarding watercolor tattoos, don't hesitate to leave those in the comments down below. I've done a bunch of these type of tattoos, so I feel like I'm gonna be able to answer most questions that you guys might have regarding them. So with that said, I hope you guys really enjoyed the video. I'm gonna try to get another one up for you guys pretty soon, and we'll see you next time.